to squat. It looks like their butt's tucking under, posterior tilt, Hank Hill butt, whatever you want to say. Putting that Zercher load on them gets them to get their thorax ahead of their ass. Am I saying that right?
Yep.
And then that just seems to clean that up. Whereas if you're typical anteriorly tilted, lordotic, extended, whatever, we're trying to keep their upper body stacked up on top of their hips, right? The opposite of what we just talked about. So front squat, goblet, heels elevated, gets them to stack up more appropriately.
And that's why you see the different like lower extremity presentations. If you ask someone to jump and stick a landing versus doing like quick repetitive pogo hops. So if I jump and stick a landing, there isn't the need to turn everything back around and push it up away from the ground. So I can maintain hip flexion, external rotation and abduction because I'm not trying to push my guts back up. I can let my pelvic diaphragm remain eccentrically oriented because I'm not changing direction. Whereas if I'm doing something like a quick pogo hop, you're automatically going to start to see the internal rotation at the hips increase because you can't let the pelvic diaphragm descend to such a great extent if you want to be able to get off the ground quickly.
That was Mike Kozak and Stephen Laflamme. You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, Simply Faster. There are a lot of sports technology companies out there, but Simply Faster is the only website you can go to that features an online store that covers the bandwidth of training technology, from force plates to timing systems to muscle stimulators and more. Some products of Simply Faster that I use and love include things like the Freelap timing system in K-Box or coach's favorites such as GymAware. Recently, Simply Faster has added 2 units that as a coach you should definitely take a look at. The first is the Muscle Lab Contact Grid, which is an extremely affordable and portable, step-by-step, literally, system to collect data on jumps, bounds, sprints, agility, hurdle hops, and really as much as your creative mind can imagine. In what used to take a whole runway worth of data collecting strips, the Contact Grid does it all with only 2 small strips that together cover up to 40 meters of sprinting. Ground contact time, step rates, rhythms, and beyond are at your fingertips with this device. Another new unit, the VO2 Master, is an ultra-portable gas exchange analyzer. Don't guess on energy system development when you can get direct insight into VO2 capabilities in relation to specific sports skills, rather than being hooked up to tubes on a treadmill or worse yet, a cycle ergometer to get a VO2 max. Think of the VO2 Master as your own gas exchange lab without the tubes and wires. Deepen your analysis in the specific conditioning preparation of your athletes with the VO2 Master today. These products and incredible customer service make Simply Faster your go-to for your sports technology needs. I'm happy to have partnered with them in sponsoring this podcast. Their support has been tremendous, so check them out today at simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Welcome to episode 184 of the Just Fly Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Joel Smith. Thanks for being here today. Our guests are Mike Kozak and Stephen Laflamme. Mike Kozak is a coach and owner of SOAR Fitness in Columbus, Ohio. Mike has trained hundreds of youth athletes as well as a number of current and prospective college and pro athletes. Mike is a mentee of Adarian Barr, and he frequently hosts Adarian's Rewire clinics out of his facility. Mike is a fervent student of biomechanics and cutting-edge sports performance techniques. He is also well-versed in the world of PRI, or Postural Restoration Institute. Mike has also written several articles for Just Fly Sports, and is a guy that I've loved bouncing ideas off of over the past year or two. Stephen Laflamme is a physical therapist. He achieved his clinical doctorate of physical therapy from The Ohio State University in 2016. Stephen is also a certified strength and conditioning specialist, as well as an Olympic weightlifter with experience on the national level. Stephen has traveled the country to be a part of the nation's best educational programs and learn from the nation's best professionals. Stephen and Mike work together with athletes in Columbus, Ohio, Mike on the coaching end of things and Stephen on the physical therapy end. So for the show today, one of the things I really wanted to get to with these guys is they do such an amazing job of individualizing programs to the athlete on the level of resistance training, speed, sprint training, jump training. They do an amazing job of taking the wide, holistic view of human performance in the body and finding the things that work the best for the individual athlete to elicit performance. So for the show today, we're going to get into things like bilateral and single leg squatting, which everyone has their own favorite variations. And many times we have a favorite variation based off something we liked, or perhaps a coach that we liked and respected had a favorite of their own, and so we utilize that. But Mike and Steven are really going to get into what individual aspects of athletes, what postures, what presentations, what hip alignments are going to make one squat variation, say a Zercher squat versus a front squat, better than another. We're also going to address these concepts on the level of single leg squats, and as well as the generalities that represent best practices for the widest swath of the bell curve of athletes. So not individualizing things, what types of squats tend to hit or check off the most boxes for what the athletic qualities we want to develop in utilizing this mode of exercise. Another thing that we're going to get into, and really it's almost like passing the baton of sorts, but is the idea of knees in, valgus, and that whole array, or that whole arena of performance. And Justin Moore, a few episodes ago, did a fantastic deep dive into that. On the show today, Mike and Steven are going to go a little bit more into that and the level of practical recommendations in squatting and jumping, and how these things are playing out in their program and what they're looking for. Finally, we're going to get into a little bit on the foot, and particularly what Mike has taken from Adarian Barr and the things that he is utilizing with his athletes on the level of foot training. So this show, front to back, really, truly fantastic, and just helps us to individualize things for our athletes a little better, as well as just pay respect to just different alignments and presentations, and also come away with some better general principles for just how to program the squat a little bit better. Again, really cool show. Love talking to these guys. So let's get on to it. Episode 184. So anyways, one thing I'd really love to get into with both you guys. I've talked with you both on some length on these details, but like how different athletes squat based on different hip and pelvic structures. And I know it can get a little complex, but I'd like to start with just a general guideline of using different types of squats, front squat, Zercher, etc., based on what an athlete is coming to you with, and why are you doing that?
Yeah, I think table tests, just looking at someone's passive range of motion and what they have access to, can be a good starting point. But then also looking at how they move, while they're split squatting or squatting. Based on how they move and combining that with the table test, then you can set up an exercise with the appropriate constraints to help them move in the manner that you desire. And so that could be adding load to one side of the body versus the other. That could be, biasing the movement with a cable row or cable press. There's really multiple ways you could just manipulate the load or foot position in order to get the desired response.
Yeah, I mean, on my end, so just every kid I train does not see Steven, obviously. So if a kid I train, I'm like, hey, man, whether they're in pain or not, I recommend their folks, hey, see Steven. And he sends me an email and says, here's the way to load them. He's like, I would recommend Zercher loading, heels elevated. Then that takes the guesswork out on my end. That's what I'm using. For my general population of kids that don't see Steven, they're not in pain, whatever, for me, I just go with whatever looks best. And obviously taking, all the kids that I've had see Steve, be like, oh, this kid seems to fit the mold of someone Zercher squats would help. On my end, higher box, safety bar squats seem to be the one that I would say works the best for the majority of my population. There's just something about that safety bar that kind of, I'd almost say it's like the trap bar of squat bars. I don't know, Steven, you could throw your 2 cents in on that, but it seems to just make squatting look better for most of my kids as opposed to a traditional back or front.
How high a box are you talking about before? Just quickly, how high a box are you typically talking about there?
Well, he'll indicate, so we've been big on the heels elevated ramps. Again, another thing that just, because we're always looking at the feet, and I'm sure we'll get into that, putting them up on that seems to buy them some more room to sit down. So if you got someone that sits way far back, the heels elevated ramp to a bar, and that typically I count about 2 inches for heels elevated ramp. So let's just say a kid, I'd like to squat him to a 16-inch box. We might heels elevate them and go 16-inch box plus a RX pad. And if they're young, eventually be like, all right, let's see if we can get them to 15 inches. How does it look? Lighter weight. Okay, looks pretty good. Let's stay there. Oh, no, that looked awful. Let's just stick with 16. Personally, I really don't. My goal is not to get every single kid ass to grass, obviously, or even parallel. So.
And I think the initial progression of like a high box, it often does look better, but I think there are reasons that it usually looks better other than it's just higher. So in order to squat effectively, you need to be able to posteriorly rotate the pelvis. And the hamstrings are a really important muscle to be able to do that. By squatting to a high box, you allow the hamstrings to always stay within the range of motion where they can contribute to hip extension. Whereas if I squat down to parallel, because the hamstring is now running parallel with the femur, they don't have a hip extension moment anymore. So if you can keep people up high initially, it can make it a little bit easier for them to find and feel their hamstrings in order to posteriorly rotate the pelvis. And so you can get that nice kind of stacked shoulders over the hips position that you're usually looking for to start with. So I think that's one reason.
I like that. So basically a hamstring centric, it's really about the hamstrings at the end of the day. And the position just kind of is a reflection of that, if they're engaging that muscle or not.
I think it can be, just from experience. If I have people squat low, they can never feel their hamstrings contributing to the movement. But if I keep them up high on a high box, they have a much better chance of keeping the hamstrings engaged and the hips underneath them. And I think that's because of the hip extension moment of the hamstring when they're in a more shallow degree of hip flexion.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that Justin Moore just talked about that recently, like keeping that ischial tuberosity lined up. And it's just the same thing as sprinting as well. As we live in this, I think very much of the sports performance and training field lives in a world of positions. Get to this position, get to parallel, sprint with your knee yay high, et cetera, but every time we do that, it takes out, it kind of devoids us a little bit potentially of another element, like you said, feeling your hamstring or sprinting with your knee too high, timing of the Achilles tendon and the impulse of the calf. So I really like how that it really lends to a feel base. Make sure you're feeling this in the movement. As soon as you get to a certain position and you aren't, then that becomes a problem.
Yeah, I think it lets you know, like, if the motion is legal or not. Like if they get into a position and it looks good, and you ask them, hey, what do you feel like is going on here? And they say, oh, well, for the example, if they're squatting, they say, oh, I just feel it all in the front of my thighs, and you're going after hamstrings. Well, then you probably didn't accomplish the goal that you wanted, or they're not achieving the task in what you would consider a correct or optimal manner. So I think asking clients, hey, where do you feel this, kind of definitely lets you know if they've achieved the task in the manner that you wanted them to.
Do you guys feel like, and maybe Stephen, particularly for you, because I know, Mike, you had said Stephen could recommend a type of squat based on an athlete's presentation. So why specifically might you recommend, say, a Zercher versus a front squat or a single leg squat? I think a lot of times, and even myself, in the field, will just recommend these just for the sake of variety, get some rotation, not doing the same thing. And it's, it's fun to switch things up, obviously. But from a presentation-based standpoint, why are you recommending one squat over another?
Sure. So I'd probably start with talking about split squat variations. I think those are usually a little bit easier for clients to grasp initially, and then maybe talk about more bilateral, like typical squatting. Usually we'll try to start people more in a split squat pattern because it's usually easier for them to balance. They have their feet spread way apart. They have a huge base of support. It usually makes the balance aspect a lot easier. From a posterior pelvic rotation standpoint, because my hip is in a more shallow degree of hip flexion in that split squat. It also makes hamstrings a little bit easier to engage. But so with a split squat, for example, like if I do a unilateral loading variation, so I have my left foot in front and I add a kettlebell to my right side, that's going to bias hip internal rotation of my front leg. Whereas if I do a split squat with my left foot in front and a kettlebell in my left hand, that would bias hip external rotation of my front leg. And so you could correlate those two things with like getting into a cut versus being able to get out of a cut, where if people can't get into a cut, maybe they need more of that hip internal rotation and contralateral loading, whereas if they can't get out, then you might do more ipsilateral loading. You could even modify that even more just based on where you place the load on the right side or the left. So if I'm doing, again, the split squat with my left foot in front and a weight on my right side, if I put the weight up in like a kettlebell front rack position, I'm going to need more trunk inclination forward in order to get the weight over my base of support. Whereas if I'm just holding the kettlebell down by my side, my trunk will be more upright as I execute that hip internal rotation. So now I can kind of bias not only hip internal rotation, but whether my trunk is tipping forward or backward, while also addressing hip rotation.
So that's really awesome. I was going to say with that too, and because I was going to get into this as well, but people who present with an anterior or a posterior tilt kind of naturally, like, and this is something that you guys have taught me that really sticks with me, is the idea of someone who, and I think this is all from Bill Hartman, but if someone who has a very anteriorly tilted position and doesn't really get out of it so much, they would need more of the posterior type cues, or maybe they would need that front rack position to get them posteriorly tilted, versus someone who, you've talked about people who are posteriorly tilted, they need to spill their Mike, I think you said Hank Hill, but they need to spill their guts forward. So for a posteriorly tilted person, would they be better with hands up, like the dumbbell holding straight down on the bottom to kind of facilitate that? Is that what you're getting at for holding like in a goblet versus at your sides?
I think it would be different depending on whether your feet are side by side or if you're in a split squat.
Okay.
Because now where my weight is biased within the base of support is different. So if I'm doing like a bilateral squatting variation with my feet side by side, if I put that load up higher towards my head at like shoulder level, that's going to push me more upright. My trunk's going to be more upright, and it would bias that posterior orientation of the pelvis. Whereas if I'm holding the load lower, like down in like a Zercher squat position, then my hips are going to translate further backwards in that, symmetrical feet side by side type of squat. But if I'm doing something like a split squat where I only have the weight on one side, because I have to get my weight over my base of support, which in this case is my front foot where most of my weight would be, I would have to incline at the trunk more if I'm holding the kettlebell up by my shoulder, because that's the only way I can get the load over my foot. Whereas if it's down by my side, now my hips would actually have to, I wouldn't incline at the trunk as much and wouldn't anteriorly orient the pelvis, because that would actually push the weight further away from the base of support that I'm trying to push from.
I was going to say, I really like the internal external rotation thing. I really see that because I know that's one of the things that we were going to talk a little bit about, internal rotation range with athletes. But what would the reason be for trying to, from either an injury or performance standpoint, in a single leg position, trying to get someone more forward leaning or trying to get them more vertical leaning?
It's going to impact the position of the femur and the lower extremity below. And, depending on, so if someone's like really, really kind of spongy when they jump and land and they can't get off the ground quick, those are usually the people that you see that are, have like a sway back posture or it looks like the hips are kind of tipped backwards.
I got you.
So by bringing everything forward and getting some more trunk inclination, it helps unweight the pelvic floor a little bit and can help make the movement a little bit, snappier and more elastic off the ground. Whereas, those people that are already have a lot of anterior pelvic orientation and everything's already tipped forward, they usually can't descend down. They hit the ground and they're very elastic. They have a tough time loading. And so by tipping the hips backwards, it allows a little bit softer loading response. It gives them more time up in when they land on the ground. So by biasing the trunk forward or to a more upright position, it would kind of change those characteristics of landing, where when they're more upright, they're probably a little bit softer. If everything tips forward, it's very abrupt, hard landings.
I love it. It really draws out the observational quality. You have to watch how the athlete performs. Are they reactive, soft, or spongy? Are they, and what do we program as a result of that? Mike, do you have anything to add in terms of what you're doing from the performance-driven sector and things, and what you're seeing with athletes?
Honestly, that's why I confide in Steven and keep smart people around me, right? Because there's a reason I didn't give you that. I'm not answering that question, right? It's one, like I said, if he tells me to load a kid a certain way, then that's what I do. And hopefully the kid goes to see him again, and then he'll send me a new write-up and say, all right, let's go this route. You had said, I think you just said it, from an observation or the look test thing on my end, it's like, okay, the way I'm loading this kid right now just isn't looking good, and they're not feeling it where I need to feel it. Knowing Steven and what he's told me, I have a lot more tools in the box. Okay, all right, let's try Zercher. Let's try heels elevated. Let's try this. Do you feel it? Yes. Okay, that's a win. Let's do that for a couple weeks. And because, like I said, at the end of the day, I don't really care what tools we use to load them. I just want them to play well and obviously be healthy. And then, obviously, from a business standpoint, continue to have their parents pay me to train them. Anybody that's listening to this that's in my private sector, I would imagine that resonates. So.
Yeah, being able to have options to give athletes what they need is so critical. So just for a summary too, before we kind of move on from this one, is maybe you answered already, but just to summarize, what would be the advantage of why might I Zercher someone versus fronts? So it's based on the load. So or maybe this is just me summarizing in my own mind. A Zercher, the weight is lower, so that would potentially encourage a more forward tilt of the torso. So that could be better for somebody who is a sway back type person.
Yeah. So for again, going back to the look test, if you're a strength coach in a weight room, the kid that you're like, man, I just cannot get their ass behind them to squat. It looks like their butt's tucking under, posterior tilt, Hank Hill butt, whatever you want to say. Putting that Zercher load on them gets them to get their thorax ahead of their ass. Am I saying that right?
Yep.
And then that just seems to clean that up. Whereas if you're typical anteriorly tilted, lordotic, extended, whatever, we're trying to keep their upper body stacked up on top of their hips, right? The opposite of what we just talked about. So front squat, goblet, heels elevated, gets them to stack up more appropriately. So it's really, on my end with my general population, it's just those two puzzle pieces. That's where I go. And then if they see Steven and he tells me otherwise, then we go that way.
Yeah, just trying to find easy solutions that they can execute without having to cue them to death. You can change front foot elevation versus rear foot elevation. You can change plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. You can change where you add the weight. Just trying to find easy solutions where you can just hand them, okay, here's a sandbag, do the squat. And you're just looking for whatever allows them to execute the movement however you deem acceptable with the least amount of cueing as possible. Because if you're having to cue someone to death, it ends up, it just turns into a shit show and you can't really get anything accomplished.
Right, especially in a group exercise environment like I run, Zercher squats are pretty safe. We don't have to have I can watch them. I don't have to stand behind them and spot them. I just got to hand them the bag. Now I've gone as far as using the Pentagon attachment on a landmine stack that up on a bunch of bumper plates and have a kid do what will look like a trap bar deadlift, because the way the landmine flows, it just makes them tilt forward. So, kids, I want to kind of hinge your deadlift a little bit. Even that option works. So.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, right on. So with all of this, and Stephen, you mentioned it a little bit in the context of single leg work, in biasing what hand is that weight or kettlebell or dumbbell in, working more of it, giving it more of an IR internal rotation or ER external rotation bias. Do you guys have any more? And I think internal rotation is the big one, just in something that's, if you don't have it, it's going to cause some issues in change of direction, agility, or potentially reactivity, things like that. We talk about inside edge and Adarian Barr a lot. So we could talk about that too within the scope of this question. But how do you approach working with athletes who might lack a hip or internal rotation?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, where hip internal rotation is absolutely critical. And I know that, this is something, a concept largely kind of provided by Bill Hartman. I know Justin Moore talked about it, where, internal rotation is needed for compression, and that's going to be how, you're able to overcome gravity and, jump off the floor, do anything like that. So you can manipulate foot setup in order to kind of give the client the best chance of attaining some sort of internal rotation. So initially, like if someone's really, really limited in hip internal rotation, then going back to like a split squat example, if I'm trying to get more internal rotation of the left leg, I might initially set them up in a split squat with the left foot forward. And what this does is it puts them basically in almost towards the hip external rotation end of the spectrum. So think of walking at, initial contact, early stance of gait, my hip is in external rotation. And so that's essentially the position of the left leg in the split squat in this example. So because they're biased towards the end of external rotation, they have some internal rotation available to them. Even if it's going from ER to 0, or what you would consider neutral, you're still allowing them to get some internal rotation of the front hip. So maybe initially, early on, working on internal rotation with the leg in front of the hips could be a good way to start to get some sort of internal rotation. And then you can move towards the feet being in more of a symmetrical pattern front to back, whether that's a lateral squat or like a lateral split stance. Now that would be like the mid stance of gait, and I've added some hip internal rotation by way of my pelvis moving over my femur. And once they get really good at that, then you can finally move towards getting internal rotation at terminal stance. And so that would be like step ups with a knee drive. That could be, like a cable row where you're rowing, in this example, rowing with the left hand and my left foot is behind me. That would force me towards the maximum IR end of the spectrum, where I'm getting IR adduction and extension of the leg.
That last one reminds you a little bit of like the Franz Bosch like hip lock type stuff in the step up, where you're finishing in a little bit of that position. And so I like that sequence, the starting with the basic split squat, and then the kind of a lateral squat, stand side to side, and then eventually a single leg. So each subsequent piece of that sequence is basically starting you in less external rotation, basically. So you have less room for IR in each of those three progressions.
So the initial, like starting with the left foot in front, because I'm starting in hip external rotation, then I have a huge bandwidth of IR that I could potentially access, even if it's, whereas once I get my leg behind me, now I only can use the very end of the IR spectrum. So think of it almost as the same as the way the hips move during gait. If my right ASIS is way in front of my left hip, then I'm already in internal rotation, so I have less to use. Whereas if my hip's behind, now I have all my internal rotation still available to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think it can get pretty complex, but I like the way you laid it out there really sequentially. Mike, is there anything from a general perspective just that you guys are trying to hit across the bandwidth of your performance training sessions?
Well, in terms of that, so split stance cable rows and half kneeling, various split squats, all of those things are programmed in a progression that, I would deem appropriate for each kid, which, I'm training kids, mind you, so 12, 13, 14-year-olds. A lot of it is just some isometric, so, a 3-position isometric split squat where, like he says, we'll put and I'll start with saying I assess every kid for a half hour one-on-one. So I got some notes on them, right? Like this kid absolutely can't split squat. Or it doesn't look like he can IR on his left hip, whatever. So, cueing zipper on big toe is something I learned from Steven to get that IR. So, if I got a kid that is just clearly can't IR his left hip, in a split squat, getting them to, move the pelvis on the femur to get the zipper on the big toe. And then the magic question, do you feel your hamstrings? So that question really should be painted on our wall at the gym.
Do you feel your hamstrings?
It's, I'm palpating hamstring, and that's the thing, man, you can know if a person's hamstring is on. So then it becomes this, okay, this kid, I feel an ipsilateral split stance cable row is the best option for him because I'm really trying to get, they're a kid that we have deemed we need to load them, okay, or they lack IR. So they might do a cable row with the left arm and the left foot in front of them, right? Well, then maybe the next month we'll do what Steven just said. We'll take that go contralateral. So now we're working that left hip when it's now an extension, which would be down the line in progression. Or if I got someone that's on the opposite end, we might just start them contralateral. And to be honest with you, my kids that don't see Steven, or I'm like, this kid kind of looks down the middle. Contralateral seems to be a little bit easier to teach, so we just start there, and then we make adjustments, as I see fit.
So with kind of lending in, so internal rotation, I think it does lend in, and I know Justin Moore covered this a lot in a recent podcast, but I've really seen some cool videos from you guys showing different types of athletes with different presentations and different needs in regards to the whole knees in and jumping element. And so I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit in terms of ACL prevention. So I know Justin really went into a lot of Bill Hartman's work and the hydraulic aspects and the pelvic opening and outlet, pelvic floor aspects, the respiration aspects. But in terms of what you guys, I think one thing I've learned from you guys is the timing of the knees. When does the knees in happen in the jump cycle? Could you tell me a little bit about your approach and some of the biomechanics that you guys are looking at in that regard?
Well, I know they've you've had some people on here talk about, just everything agreeing, if the femur's internally rotating, the tibia should be as well, definitely looking for that agreement between the upper and lower leg to, deem the internal rotation as legal. Most typically that hip internal rotation occurs when the person is attempting to turn around at the bottom of the jump. So as I hit the bottom and my skeleton stops moving, my guts are still descending within my body. And so to stop that descent, I need to internally rotate, concentrically elevate the pelvic diaphragm to start to push everything back up. And that's why you see the different lower extremity presentations. If you ask someone to jump and stick a landing versus doing quick repetitive pogo hops. So if I jump and stick a landing, there isn't the need to turn everything back around and push it up away from the ground. So I can maintain hip flexion, external rotation and abduction because I'm not trying to push my guts back up. I can let my pelvic diaphragm remain eccentrically oriented because I'm not changing direction. Whereas if I'm doing something like a quick pogo hop, you're automatically going to start to see the internal rotation at the hips increase, because you can't let the pelvic diaphragm descend to such a great extent if you want to be able to get off the ground quickly.
It makes me think a little bit about, and Mike, I know with Adarian Barr, we talk about the timing of the Achilles loading and unloading, and I think particularly like a single stance, like sprint gait, it almost seems to me that in a bilateral, the timing of the guts, you look at the timing of the guts going up and down, and how does that load and unload being something to be mindful of in how this athlete is performing this bilateral. Because I think we do talk about, well, does bilateral valgus, I guess you could say illegal, obviously, if we're talking about something that's not good, lead to a single leg problem or a single leg landing problem, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of what we're seeing in bilateral, if we're seeing these come in, is in terms of the guts. How is the guts projecting up and down?
The same thing happens on a single leg. I just don't know that it's maybe as readily apparent as when you're having someone to do a double leg.
Okay.
Do a double leg jump. But that, pistoning up and down of the guts is definitely still happening. But I do think it's just a little bit harder to pick up.
The trampoline's a little the pelvic floor trampoline's probably a little different in that situation.
Mm-hmm. But you still need to be able to concentrically orient that hemidiaphragm to be able to push off one leg.
In terms of timing, so if I'm watching, because this is something I've looked at a little bit, and I think we've talked about this before, but like the timing of when, in terms of the jump cycle. So let's just even say a basic like a small scale depth jump, or even or maybe like a small hurdle jump or something like that, like an athlete's jumping over some 12-inch hurdles or whatnot. And in terms of the timing of when their knees are going in relative to the push off, the extension, or the loading, how does that play into it? Like, for example, when an athlete's in their deepest point of loading versus as they're extending, and then I know the pelvis plays a role, the positioning of the pelvis, but could you guys go into that a little bit, just from a timing perspective?
Yeah. So when the feet first hit the ground, they're going to be in some sort of flexion, abduction, external rotation. The hips will be, and what that does is allows everything to descend. When I need to turn that around is when I'm going to need to start to internally rotate at the hips. So I'm going to reach maximum hip internal rotation when I'm having the most upward force against the ground. Once I get the guts moving in the right direction, then I can finish hip extension in some sort of external rotation without the negative consequence of the pelvic diaphragm descending, because it's already unloaded and pushed everything up. So I can finish hip extension because the pelvic diaphragm is already unloaded. So that's why you might see like external rotation and abduction at the right before the feet leave the ground, because the pelvic diaphragm is already unloaded.
Yeah, that's a cool way of putting it. I've always just thought of it. I think I've lived a little bit more foot centrically the last year, so I had just looked at it as pronation and supination, and you're supinating as you're toeing off with that figure eight, but the gut element of it, like, I think is fantastic. And so in summary, the max IR in a bilateral jump is at the peak, the peak force, wherever that peak force is going to be. That's when we want legal maximum internal rotation, or triangle, like Adarian says.
Yeah. And on my end, like you said, the feet. A lot of these kids, I will probably get to. I mean, they just got to know they have feet in their shoe. So at the reversal, if we're seeing some kind of just toes out and knees in, and I've said it before in Jake Tur's pocket, that's not the inside edge we're looking for. That's knees in to lose.
Knees in to lose. That's a knees in to lose.
Anyone is no one on our end is a Rewire, Adarian. No one is advocating, complete collapse of the ankles. None of that. So it's some of these kids at reversal. again, I keep saying kids because, again, that's who we're training. They're just not, Adarian's a big transverse arch guy. They're just at reversal. That transverse arch is kicking out, the heels are dumping in, and then that's at that point in time that we start talking about our strategies in terms of pressures and loading and, okay, what do we need to do? Because, a lot of my young kids, they hurdle hop, and what you just said, ER and IR, it all looks good. I don't have any reason to coach it on do anything. It doesn't need to be cued. So cueing knees in is something we never, ever do. I think Justin said the same thing. It's just because I video them, looks good. No need to fix it. Let's just keep rolling on. Or, the foot, that looks really bad. That they're not in agreement, and that's Adarian's term. Knees, feet, hips in agreement. That's the triangle, strongest structure on the planet. And you can tell when a kid has a bad triangle, it's just that foot just completely just blows out, goes outward, and now you're on a really unstable, poor base.
Yeah. So to summarize, so to you, and I mean, not just to you, but this being a principle. So a bad triangle to you would be a not in agreement triangle, meaning at that point of peak internal rotation or knees in, the toes are going out basically.
Yeah, and like he says, tibia is ERing and the femur is IRing, and that's the mechanism everyone talks about for ACL. But for some reason, we've gotten into just straight band walking and sticking jumps and not addressing the actual components of, again, what are the feet doing, is one. And, okay, are the feet doing that because we can't load the hips, or are the feet doing it because we have absolutely no idea what the feet are doing? And, again, those are just all the puzzle pieces that, I'm left to put together. And hopefully if I see someone that shows those signs and they're in pain, especially, then hopefully I can convince their parents to see Stephen, and then it makes the whole process a lot easier for myself.
I think that for more, that the knee and the thigh and shin not being in agreement is more a symptom than the cause. That's usually a compensatory strategy that they're trying to use. But it's not the cause of what's causing the thigh and lower leg to not be in agreement. So I think starting at the knee and just having them push out against a band, while that would certainly, ER the femur and IR the tibia to help put them in agreement, it's also not addressing the cause of what it would be causing that excessive transverse plane knee motion in the first place.
Yeah, it's just, and like I think you've mentioned, Stephen, if perhaps like the pelvis is rotated externally, and the pelvis, and there's just not a lot of internal rotation, and you're basically just cranking someone into more external rotation or something like that with doing just clamshells. You're not fixing the agreement of the pelvis and the hip and the diaphragm as someone's dropping down.
Absolutely. You need internal rotation to be able to push off the ground. So it's like if I'm landing in a single leg jump and my hips are turned away from my stance foot, I'm going to get all that internal rotation from my femur. My femur is going to dive in. It's going to be trying to get underneath my base of support and basically just following my hips turning away from my stance foot. Whereas if when I land, my zipper is towards the big toe and my hips are turned towards that foot, I've gotten the internal rotation from my pelvis turning over my femur as opposed to the converse. And that's going to allow for me to get the internal rotation that I need, but with keeping everything in agreement, the hip, knee, and foot all pointed straight ahead versus them going in all different directions.
Mike, in terms of what you're seeing in squatting, this is something I've been thinking about a little bit, and the idea of what are you allowing during squatting in terms of, maybe just for an average athlete. I mean, I think the typical prescription is, jam your knees out, jam max ER, et cetera, et cetera. How are you setting up athletes to squat in respect to what you're letting their knees do, their feet, their hips, and that type of thing?
Again, it starts with my assessment and keep in mind that I do train a lot of kids that lift weights at school, and some programs are a lot better than others. I'll just leave it at that. So if I got a kid that tells me he squats 315, 330, whatever, and I'm watching him in my first assessment exercise is just a shoes off body weight squat. Just start doing it. And you can learn a lot. Like, wow, that kid's heels are completely diving in, his toes are going out, and he has absolutely no idea that he's doing it, right? So, what the first thing is I got to make him aware of what his feet are doing, and we cut the depth to right before where those feet move. Okay, so or feet, whether it's heels come up, heels steer out, heels steer in. To me, under load in a squat, none of those things are good, right? And that speaks back to what we talked about the high box squat. So we would probably I do a lot of just long duration isometrics with a kid like that, whether it be on the belt squat machine or whether we decide to go Zercher goblet front, heels elevated, whatever. But in terms of the knees, I'm definitely not cueing them to push their knees out. I've found recently where I'm more cueing them to keep their knees in line with their second toe and big toe. And then we'll play around with it. Looks a little bit better to have this kid toed out at maybe more towards 1 o'clock at 11 o'clock, or, oh no, they got neutral feet. And again, those are notes I'm making in their assessment anyways. And obviously those things could change a little bit. But we're definitely not putting, very seldom, I'm not going to say never, we're definitely not putting bands around feet or bands around knees. We are putting a ball between knees to get IR and hamstrings. So there's just a little trick I learned from Steven. A heel's elevated like a little bit of a tiny soccer ball, just a couple inches in diameter in between the knees, and then probably more of a high box heels elevated squat. You want someone to feel their hamstrings in the squat? We're definitely doing that. And even if my kids have to lift weights at school, I'm not like overtaxing them with that kind of squat. And then my hope is to ingrain in them that they need to be understanding what their feet are doing when they're in the weight room at school. And maybe we want to back the weight down from 315 to 185, 135 for a while, just based on what I've seen. But that hopefully that answers your question. With my young kids, it's just simply not letting them do it bad. Let's do isometrics. Let's do 2 sets of 10. Let's go to 1 by 20. Okay, let's go to 1 by 14. We better be able to do something heavier at 14 than at 20. Okay, we do some APRE 10 type stuff. Obviously, bodies change. We want to get them to some sort of barbell front squat or safety squat, whatever. But sometimes I find myself taking that away and going backwards again. So, these are kids, again, with changing bodies and minds. So
I think just getting the hips underneath people is, just changing hip orientation is an easy way to get a change in knee position. So if my hips dump forward, my knees are going to naturally start to come together and my femur is going to internally rotate. If I'm able to posteriorly tip the pelvis, my knees are going to naturally start to track away from each other. So adjusting, just being able to manipulate the pelvis position, whether it's tipped forward or backward, can be an easy way to get a resultant change in knee position.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, and that's something I've learned from you guys that I've seen. It's really I just think we tend to only look, like you said before, if it's the knees, we often tend to look only at the joint. Oh, your knees are in. Oh, do some clamshells. But that it's the hip position is that super easy manipulator of where the knees are actually going to go and what range they're allowed. And I think that's something that's very easily missed. So I feel like this is a question, but I feel like we've really just talked about it the whole time. But you guys' approach to total ACL prevention is really more about making sure things are in agreement and the athletes are feeling and sensing more so than, oh, your knees are in, let's just get them out, so that would probably be, it's really the whole thing. I ask people, it's really more the whole thing than it is just one component, avoiding one component. Or are there any correlations that you guys have seen? It's like, okay, if you have this could be a really big factor in the ACL equation.
So if you look at the ACL's attachment sites, it attaches on the back inside of the femur and then, on the front outside of the shin. And so that if my femur spins in and my tibia spins out, that would be what, maximally tensions the ACL and could put it at risk for rupture. So anything that you can do to try to get tibial internal rotation and femoral external rotation to help take the ACL off tension would be something that helps protect that ligament. And for a lot of knee conditions, people always talk about the importance of the VMO, and that's why in the closed kinetic chain, the VMO acts to internally rotate the tibia and externally rotate the femur. And again, ways to promote that position that would protect the ACL, I would say it's most often getting some type of posterior pelvic orientation because that's going to bias the femur into external rotation.
And Mike, I know, by the way, too, you're from what I know, your track record or results in terms of you having not many kids end up with knee injuries has been pretty phenomenal using all this type of work, right?
Well, I mean, first of all, I personally we don't even talk about ACL prevention. Of course, I'll get a parent or so that calls me. I personally we don't use that term ACL prevention. We don't speak about it. I just say we move as well as we can. Disasters can happen. And unfortunately, I had a kid tear his ACL this summer in a summer league basketball game, and he went up for a layup, and a kid tackled him, and another kid came down on top of him. What are you going to do? I don't have any prevention strategy for that. I mean,
recreate it in the gym. No, just kidding.
We're going to start just pushing sleds into kids' knees, and say, okay, here we go. Here's our prevention. I just don't talk about it. We've had a really good track record, but even before I didn't know anything about pressures and PRI and foot steering and transverse arch or what, and even when I was clamshelling people, we didn't have those problems. And I think it's just I don't allow shitty movement, and we train fast. And if it doesn't look right, we make changes, and use proper progressions. So, and I think it's Mike Boyle has always said that it's ACL prevention is just moving well. So we've never promoted bad movement. So I would imagine, just like any other trainer or coach that operates the same way, probably has about the similar track record. Now, with that being said, I had a kid rupture his Achilles this past winter with absolutely no explanation for why it happened. And I certainly wasn't doing Achilles prevention training, and nor am I going to start doing it. It just was a freak accident, and unfortunately, those things happen. And to be honest, I don't know how preventable they are beyond doing the things that we're already doing.
Sure. Yeah. Even even like Achilles, a European decathlete sent me a book of his. Former K-State decathlete had sent me a book of his to read, and he had ruptured his while competing, and he said he just had a genetically thinner Achilles. Sometimes there's just stuff that happens in there, but that's really humble of you to put it that way, and like you were alluding to with Mike Boyle, just allowing good movement and creating an environment for good movement, I think is so important, and knowing what that is too. And being a real true observer. And so one of the things, and I think this could lead us into the last question with the feet, and still on the squatting train a little bit, but this is something that you had mentioned that Adarian had taught you is an outlier squat. And I don't think this is a squat in terms of a barbell squat, but maybe it's a nice gateway for talking about the feet. And I don't know if you ever do look at this in actual squatting motions in the way you're training, but what is an outlier squat in terms of the foot and the transverse arch and that appearance?
Adarian uses outlier a ton, but in terms of the outlier squat, outlier jump, it's that athlete that probably owns a ton of dorsiflexion range of motion. And so I guess really kind of having even gained more understanding, but talking about what Stephen talked about, pressures, that's the person that can, in a standing vertical jump, can drop their ass down to their heels, but keep their thorax on top of their butt and really generate that wouldn't be an elastic type jump, obviously, but they can. You see them, they're the guys, on the jump mat with 42, 43 inch verticals. Maybe their feet turn out a little bit or turn in. Everyone has a little bit different way of doing it. But, if I tried to do that, I'd fall on my face. I have no range. My heels come up so fast, right? These people at the bottom, their ass pulls their heels up, but it is there already way down at the bottom of the jump. And, that's kind of what we deemed an outlier because there's not a lot of people that can do that kind of thing because they have extreme range and they can own it, and they're also very fast through that range. That's one thing Adarian talks about, right, is if you're going to increase range or have a lot of range, you better be really fast through that range. So having someone that's extremely lax and slow and trying to get them, even though they can do the movement, that would not be an outlier jump or squat because it would not result in a 41-inch vertical jump or whatever.
Yeah, so speed, mobility, and the ability to engage the feet and the fascial lines through that's what yields that.
Most people doing it probably have no idea that they are. Right? They're just gifted. So we're not. My goal is not trying to get people to be an outlier vertical jumper, but I do have a kid right now. I'm getting ready for a walk-on tryout at OU, and he has all those abilities. And I was like, look, man, you should try jumping like that. And sure as shit, man, he drops his butt down his heels, reverses it, and he pops. So again, that's just knowing like, okay, we got this tool. I know what it is from Adarian. Here's one person that I could give him, and he's one out of 100 plus kids, and that would make why it's called an outlier squat, right?
Yeah, it does make me think about, like to be able to do it fast, you have to have like that fascial line. I feel like the fascial line and the myelination all driven into that system. I don't think you can just squat someone into being able to do that because then you could get there, but then it's not necessarily fast. Maybe on a level, maybe if you're an Olympic lifter and you're dropping under a squat clean, thousands and thousands of times fast, maybe you can get that a little bit. Even all those athletes don't necessarily vertical jump like that. It's really incredible. But so with the feet though, so leading into that and the foot. So Mike, let's start with you. What are some, and I'm sure you've learned a ton of stuff from Adarian, but what are some, you're going through your warm-ups, your movement. What are some ways you're getting the feet moving? You're starting to draw awareness there. What are some the big things in your arsenal on how you're engaging the feet in athletic performance practice?
Yeah, so our warm-up is barefoot, probably like most people these days, and we're not doing it barefoot to say, hey, we're barefoot people. It's really so I can see what each kid's foot is doing. And like I said, I got some 13-year-olds that, if their feet became their hands, I'm not really sure that they would actually know that happened. So like I tell the kids, at the very least, for a passing grade, you should at least know you have feet. At least know that they exist underneath your body. And, for some of these 13-year-old kids, it makes a little bit of a difference. But in our warm-ups, we might just do some, we might even do some iso lunge extremes or something like that. Sometimes it's just like what Adarian has coined base position work, which is kind of the start of everything that we do, or athletic posture, which is just that squatting down, staying vertical with the torso just before the heels come up. So it could be, just little hops in place like that. It could be split squats. It could be half or split squatted med ball throws. Sometimes our warm up is a circuit. Sometimes I have the kids line up and I just tell them what to do. And then sometimes we'll get on, what I say is the track, which is just our straightaway where we run. And, whether we're squatted running, whether we're folding up running or squatted and folding up or, doing some sort of skip or whatever, the theme is always, let's set up and know what your feet are doing. Now, if I got a big group of 10 to 12 kids, it's hard to take the time to sit down next to every single kid and get their Achilles to be set up correctly. We would get no exercise in at that time. But it's just continually giving them the reminder. I'll show them, because I'm usually barefoot at this point in time too. Here is the part of your foot that I want your pressure. If you feel yourself gripping your toes, let's let go of our toes. Okay, and then, if I have a kid, I'm like, I know this kid really needs to be cued to steer his heels out or point his toe out a little bit, whatever. Like, hey man, hey Justin, remember this is how you got set up, and just continually ingrain it. So there's not a day that goes by in the gym where what are your feet doing isn't the theme.
In terms of some of the ideas too, with the like the pinky toe up and not gripping your toes and things like that. So how does I know like the pinky toe idea works its way into what you're doing as well. Has that evolved over time, or are you always just?
That's kind of going to be the theme starting tomorrow. Like, because I can't, you can't be like, all right, we're going to train in the, people that know it. We're going to talk about flap. We're going to talk about inside edge. We're going to do sky. We typically, even though the feet we're always looking at them, we kind of have one concept. So I think tomorrow and this week, we're really going to try to push that pinky toe away in kind of some static positions. That's just one thing I got to be careful with, because that cue is not for every kid. So some of my heavily already pronated kids, that does not work very well. And then that's where using trying to get some of these kids to do the exercises on Adarian's inserts really is powerful, because now I can give them a reference with their feet. And if I want them to push pinky toe away to get inside edge, getting them to do that on that kind of platform is a lot more effective than just doing it on the carpet or in a shitty pair of Adidas, obviously.
Yeah, there's a lot more feedback on that versus just the general floor that you're kind of sinking into. And so but then also for people who haven't heard it on the show, lifting the pinky toe gives you more of the pressure on the inside edge of the foot, and it tightens the arches of the foot as well in that process. And so, but yeah, like you said, if someone's already, and maybe this is something to mention, usually we tend to lack pronation or abilities to pronate well or get power off the inside edge. But you said there are those kids who are overpronated. What is your approach for people who are kind of stuck in pronation or have those problems? And this is for either of you guys to answer.
Those are tough. They're tough. I've tried some stuff with some band steering. I think getting them to understand where their pressure needs to be. Because it just seems like when they go to transfer weight, and let's just say in a vertical jump or even like a broad jump, the heel will obviously pronate very hard and the toes can come out. And those people are like, oh yeah, they don't have a medial arch, right? That's part of the problem. Short foot exercise stuff, I don't do a whole lot of those. I think Adarian had just put a post up about how, the toes aren't really part of the arch structure. What seems to work for me is really getting them to understand that their pressure needs to be on that transverse arch ball of the foot, and getting them to do that without, if I told them to just try to push their pinky toe away, their foot just collapses because they can't do that in this already pronated position. So getting them to, I guess they probably need some supination, right? And then again, just getting them to understand here's where your pressure needs to be on this transverse arch, and literally getting down on my hands and knees and pointing to that part of their foot while they're barefoot. And then again, ingraining it with good split squats, split stance, even a split stance cable. Hey, look at your foot. What's your foot doing? Again, that's just training for performance versus just general exercise where you're just ignoring all of those factors. And in time, hopefully it works. And more times than not, I'd say it has.
Yeah, some of the foot steering concepts are a little bit newer to me, but as I was looking at them more recently, I think, you can probably set up some exercises in the gym to try to get the desired pronation or supination of the foot that you're looking for without necessarily having to do as much cueing. And so if you look at foot steering and actually compare it to a car, it actually works pretty similarly. So if I'm in a front wheel drive car and I'm trying to turn the car to the right, the right tire would turn out and the left tire would turn in as my hips turn to the right. And so you can actually bias, like if my right foot's in front and I'm turning my hips to the right, I would be getting pronation of the right foot as I'm getting internal rotation of the right hip. Whereas if I have my left foot in front and I'm turning my hips to the right, now I'm getting supination of my left foot as I'm turning the hips to the right. And so you can play with the direction that people are moving, whether it's forward and backward, and then the direction of the direction they're turning to get the supination or pronation of the foot that you're looking for.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, the foot steering too. I hadn't even thought about that till a couple of years ago when Adarian had brought it up to me, and now I see it in a lot of things now. The last thing, we're just kind of getting out of time here for the show, but Mike, I was going to ask you if outside of the warm-up, so outside of just sensation and helping people feel different parts of the foot, and I was going to say too, I really like that idea of for overpronated feeling the full transverse arch. I imagine a lot of those people, or I know a lot of those people will lose ball of the fifth, that pinky toe ball of the foot likes to come off the ground a lot. But what do you do any other so for more like the high intensity sector foot training? So do you do anything that's more intensive in terms of plyometric strength work, anything that amplifies some of these things that you've learned from Adarian, or does it just stay in the warm up and then you get the activation, you take it with you?
So, Joe, way back when I met you and started just picking your brain and paying you for your time, you'd be like, I think I was asking about, hey, how do I get kids to bound better? And you started telling me about rudiment hop series. So now we use the rudiment hops to really get what we just talked about. That's a lot of just light foot contacts, barefoot, continually understanding, hey, what are the feet? Hey, not toes, all right, heels should be tapping, just that's an easy way, to be a little bit more dynamic than just standing in base position. I'll go as far as I'll tell you, kids, we'll get in athletic posture and do these arch marches, which I think I had sent to you and you put on a post. And for 40 seconds, put pressure on your transverse arch and just tap your heels in an athletic posture. You want to talk about hamstring and glute warm up, activation. I don't care what it's called. The kids they'll be like, damn, that sucks. And then we'll do it on the belt squat with a little bit of load. Not with not my younger kids, but my older kids, we'll do that kind of stuff. So now the load is kind of weighting them down, and they got to work that. And then just neat little, we'll have little heel tapping contests on the Adarian's inserts to see, again, pressure on the transverse arch, how fast can you tap that heel, and you can't do it well if you don't have pressure on the transverse arch. So those are just little things that I will put in kids' programs, especially kids that lift weights at school. Again, that's easy stuff that seems to pay off for us. That isn't incredibly taxing. It's not affecting their workouts at school, and in the long scheme of things, it seems to get them faster. So. Yeah, because the workouts at school, and even a lot of the lower leg training is very. There's very force specific derivatives where you're really engaging that speed, that get the arch structure in place, that just fast rapid fire work that you can always do, even if you're doing another program, you can always add that in and see good results. So yeah, I love that stuff. Yeah, that and the heel tap too. I think I don't know if I think just for a quick description too. It's and you said it. It's just basically that quick twitch of the heel tapping up and down. And I've seen that. I've seen my better athletes, like my best moving tennis players, when they're like the ball's getting hit to them and they're sitting waiting with the racket. You'll watch their heels click tap up and down real fast. The fast guys do that faster than the guys who aren't moving the ball better. Sure.
It's just
if you're going to
reactive.
use a false step or what Lee Tap calls a plyo step, whatever, you have to be able to do that. It has to be that foot's going to step back, that heel's going to drop, load that Achilles. It's how quickly can you get that sucker to tap, get that foot off the ground, and get to the next step. Whereas the bad false step would be stepping far back with a straight knee, that heel just just farts on the ground, and you're not getting any sort of elastic effect or Achilles or any of those things. So heel tapping is something in our team sport population we are doing all the time.
Yeah, it's something that's it's one of the most natural athletic things I think we can do. And one of the things that Adarian pointed out when I uploaded that kid, like, I don't know if you saw it, that kid who was doing the worst form, quote unquote, the worst form in terms of if you're actually trying to lift weights safely and as per. Yeah. If you're trying to lift weights safely, it was he's heel tapping, he's rolling the bar in to do a clean, heel tapping while the bar, Adarian pointed out, he's heel tapping while the bar is rolling in. And in terms of pure elastic response off the ground, that's awesome. But in terms of being safe off the ground, obviously it's not going to be good for you in the long term. But man, I mean, the kid got the weight though. It was really an amazing thing. But
it's a team thing for everyone. Right?
Yeah. Well, anyways, I know. Hey, we're running out of time for today. It is a pleasure talking to both of you guys. It was just a blast having you on the show, and I love how you guys interact and are really hitting those different ends of that performance spectrum in getting kids healthier, stronger, and more resilient. So, hey, I appreciate you guys being on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joel.
Hey, thank you.
That does it for another episode. I'm signing out for this week. Thanks for tuning in. It was awesome talking with Mike and Steven. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to. We'd really appreciate it. And it really helps us out spreading the word and helping us climb the charts a little bit in the sport world of podcasts, sports performance, health, and nutrition. So that being said as well, please don't forget to support our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology. They have the best of in each category of sports tech, from force plates to muscle stimulators. They also have a fantastic blog, so be sure to check them out and support them. I'm out for this week. We'll see you next one with another great guest.